My name is Herb Tam. I'm the interviewer today for the oral history with Audie Chang. And so, yeah, just thanks for being part of this. Just to start, can you just say your name? If you have a Chinese name, also, if you could say that, that would be great.
Okay, my name is Audie Chang. My Chinese name is Chang.
Great. And just to put it on tape, today is April 22nd, 2025. So Audie, could you tell us where you were born, kind of where you grew up, and just sort of maybe any memories associated with where you grew up?
Oh, sure. Good to be here at Mocha. I was born in Canton, China, right after the formation of the People's Republic of China. Our family had to leave China because my father was in the military with the Kuomintang. He actually is a graduate of the Central Military Academy in Nanjing in 1937. And according to the records I was able to find, he was there for the 30 days before the Japanese took over Nanjing, and of course there's a lot of civilian atrocities, but they had all moved the headquarters, or actually the capital of China, to Chongqing, because that was part of that history. And my father moved there, and he was in the army for 8 years, and after he got out in 1945, he married my mother, who actually is from a village in Toisan. It's called Daosan, and her father, which is my grandfather, came here to the United States at the turn of the century, started a laundry and operated it for 18 years, and then went back to China because in those days, because of the Exclusion Act, there's no way he could have brought his wife or his children here to the United States. So it wasn't unusual for the early Chinese immigrants to, spend time here. It was fairly poor in the Toisan region at that time. They made enough money, just like my grandfather did, and went back to Toisan. He built a home there and stayed there. Had my mother, but he had an older son, which is 20 years older than my mom, who was very liberated, and he sent her to college. And I think she was probably one of the first Chinese women from that village to ever graduate from college. And it was the Sun Yat-sen University that she graduated from. And the story she told is that she attended college during World War II, so they had to move the college inland as the Japanese invaders came, and I think it took her 5 years to get her degree. And after World War II, she got her degree. And she and my father met in Canton, China, and had me and my brother. And they one day my father was called in for questioning because this is the time when the PRC started consolidating their administration over the southern part of China, and he had a callback, but he never attended because he saw the writing on the wall, and he basically disappeared. And apparently he escaped to Hong Kong and sent word through relatives to my mother and told her to take the kids and whatever you can carry and take the train and get out of China. So we ended up as sort of refugees in Hong Kong, where we lived for about 7 years. And at that time, I was old enough to remember there were riots in Hong Kong, and there was concern that Mao Zedong will take over Hong Kong as well. And about that same time, the United States Congress passed a law. It's called the Refugee Act of 1953. And for those who are familiar with the immigration laws, even after the repeal of the Exclusion Act, there was in its place a very tight quota of immigrants that were allowed to immigrate here legally from China. So because of this law, 1953 Refugee Act, which was intended by Congress to provide a safe haven for allies of the United States who, fought in China, and my father qualified as one of those people, and we were able to come to the United States. This is 1958. So we landed in San Francisco on the SS Wilson. At that time was the passenger ship, and it took us 3 days by train to get to New York, because under the Refugee Act you had to have a sponsor who was financially able and capable and willing to take care of you. So in a way, the immigration laws was well thought out, and it was my aunt who sponsored us. And the interesting thing is, when my grandfather came here, he came here with his brother, who stayed on, who never went back to China. So over the years, he married, had lots of kids, and my aunt was one of those. And to this day, I still have like second cousins spread out all over Chinatown as well as New York City. So after landing here, we struggled as immigrants. My father was in his 40s, very hard to find work. His first job was at the market on 50 Mott Street. It's called Wing Wall Loan. And it was because of relatives who got him that job, and we lived in a very modest tenement apartment. And that was the start of our life here. And about 2 years later, my mom had my youngest brother. And the interesting fact is, and I look to my parents a lot for inspiration. These are my models, if you will. An example is that they were refugees and immigrants, but they never looked back. They just kept on moving forward, regardless of what the risks were, or the potential challenges were. But they just kept moving, never looked back. An example is my oldest brother, was born in China under the nationalist government. I was born in China under the communist government. My sister was born in Hong Kong as a British subject, because Hong Kong was a colony at the time. And my youngest brother was born in the USA, All-American. So this is, the path of, for my family, immigrant and refugees. But we were very fortunate to be here in New York's Chinatown, because we were insulated, if you will, from the discrimination that was at the time, and also because during that time there was a Cold War, and anti-Chinese feelings were rampant in the United States. So we were fortunate to be in Chinatown, because at that time it was a very small town atmosphere. People knew other people, everybody knew everybody, and we have relatives, many of them distant ones, and it was like a village. And growing up in that environment, looking back, was a real prize for me, because I learned a lot about people, society. I participated in basketball. I was a Boy Scout in Troop 150 at True Light Church, and attended a Baptist church here. And during my teenage years, we had dances, and we were doing doo-wop music and Beatles, and we were just like any other teenagers in America, and we had a good time. And I was and looking back, it was a childhood that I'm so glad I had. Because later on in life, I look back to that for strength, because someone once said it takes a village, right? And I had a village. I wasn't, in Audie and somewhere in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which is true. A good number of Chinese immigrants who came here, because they would find themselves in communities where they were the only Asian, and I also was able to develop a lot of social skills, and which helped a lot later on in my business career. So is that?
That's great. Yeah. I want to just kind of go back and fill in some details.
Sure.
The year that you were born, if you could mention that.
Oh, I was born in 1950.
1950. Okay.
Yes.
And you were born in, you said Canton, right?
Yes. This is the city of Canton.
Yeah.
In a hospital.
Yeah.
And I still today have a birth certificate that is a Chinese Communist birth certificate. So I have that in my album.
And how old were you when you left Canton, and was your next stop then Hong Kong?
I was only 6 months old.
Okay.
Okay, and it was, we left sort of on the night train, and we went to Hong Kong.
And it was just you and your mom?
And the older brother.
And what you were doing was you were going to meet up with your dad, who had already left. Right?
Yes, he had left. Well, he escaped. He didn't tell anyone. He disappeared for 6 months because he was concerned about being. Well, there was also a purge right after the communists took over China, and which, look back in history, that's not unusual.
Right.
And there were people who, I suppose, it was difficult, perhaps, for my family to make that decision to leave China. So often you have families, you have roots in there, and in fact, my father probably, and according to my mom, he sort of lived in denial. He said, it's okay, it's a new government. He saw the light, he saw the writing on the wall after a while and says, this is getting too dangerous, too unruly, so he left.
Yeah. And he was, at that time, part of the Kuomintang, right?
Well, he left the army in 1945.
Okay.
And so he actually, right after that, found a job as a aide to the governor of Guangdong. Perhaps because of his military training and what have you. He also studied English when he was in high school, which was a very, I think, lucky turn for him, because there were not many Chinese who spoke English. In fact, in the army, he at one time for about 9 months was the interpreter, one of the interpreters for General Wittemeyer, who at that time was the U.S. general in charge of the Chinese theater. That was in Kunming. And so his language skills took him through a lot, and I think it was very, looking back, a very wonderful tool that he decided to have.
So when your family moved to America, you were, 8 years old, right? 1958,
yes,
you said?
That's right, yes.
And then so you probably have some memories of the plane ride and...
It was not a plane, it was a ship.
A ship?
Train.
Oh, wow.
A ship and train, yeah.
I mean, what kind of was going through your mind, or how were you feeling, back then about coming to America?
Coming to America was eventful in the sense that I've never traveled in ships and trains and what have you. But landing here and going to school was a real shocker. I spoke no English, and I found myself in the third grade in PS21, which no longer is closed down. But PS21 was right on Spring Street between Mott and Prince Street, and that was the first school I went to. And, I was fortunate that I had a teacher. Her name's Mrs. Goldberg, who took me under her wings, and she understood that I didn't have the language skills, but I knew my math, and she knew that there was that I could learn things, and so she did her part in trying to make sure that I didn't feel isolated, that I was part of the class. And she gave me a job during one event. We put on the Thanksgiving pageant, and I actually did the sets and for the painting the sets for the show and designed a costume. Having people roll up their socks and covering up their pants, because that's what I saw in the pictures. And I said, oh, well, that's what the pilgrims used to wear. And so I guess I have this creative side of me, and I loved it, and I'm so grateful that Mrs. Goldberg gave me that chance. Because as a kid, as you know, your self-esteem is going to be affected if you feel like you're lost in the class, which I was. But fortunately, at 8 years old, you catch on pretty quickly. So I did, and that was the beginning of my education here in the U.S.
What do you remember about the neighborhood of the school? And it's also pretty close to where you lived, right? So this was Spring Mulberry. This is what kind of Soho? What's now Soho?
Oh, it's very, very Italian. It's maybe some Eastern Europeans, and I was maybe we were one of two Chinese families whose children went to that school. And I was also appreciative, thinking back, that one of the girls in my class, this Chinese girl who lived in the area, was able to do some translation. So that helped me at least, to get through the day. So in a way, again, I consider myself lucky.
How did the other kids treat you? You said you're only one of two Chinese families. Did you feel were you made to feel different somehow?
Oh sure, we were bullied. Again, my brother also went to that school, and so did my sister. But it's mixed. There was kids who got along, and they were very curious, and they wanted to make friends. And then there are also these bullies who, at that time, there were not many Chinese in that particular area, and because I guess children being children, we were estranged, and we were picked on, and it wasn't very pleasant. So
how did you respond to that?
Well, I lost a lot of sleep. I remember I couldn't sleep. I had insomnia because I could only think about going to school the next day and having to face these people.
This is pretty serious. I mean, it sounds like scared, or what?
They didn't have counselors in those days or psychologists, but thinking back, I think I was I was paranoid for throughout not the first year, but the second year in the fourth grade, because I didn't have Mrs. Goldberg anymore. For some reason, I think maybe, I don't know, but I was put into a crazy class, and that was totally undisciplined, and I suspect in those days, these classes might have been tracked. So, for instance, if you're doing well, you're in a better class. But I suspect that because of my lack of language skills, I may have been put into a class with a lot of children with learning problems. So that was a big change, and I remember that. I noticed that, and that was not friendly. I got picked on and everything else. The teachers were. They didn't have a full-time teacher. It was just substitute teachers almost throughout the year. So it was a difficult time to live through as a kid.
How were you as a student, though? I mean, just in terms of your studies, would you consider yourself a serious student, or how?
Well, elementary school was, you just go and but I have my parents were obviously very much into education. They valued it, and I did go to school for 2 years in Hong Kong, up to the 7th grade, and I think that helped. But then again, looking back, I think you naturally learn when you learn from not just the teacher but other kids in the class, and so I picked up stuff quickly enough, and I've always been good at math because language was not a requirement to do math.
And then maybe let's talk about home life and what it was like for your parents, if you remember that. Like, what was just maybe describe your home, like your apartment, and sort of like how you felt being there.
Well, they were not there very much. They both worked, and as an older child in the family, there were 4 kids by then. Both my brother and myself, we looked after the younger kids. There were times when we would make dinner and cook. I learned to cook for my mom, and because she wasn't there to do the cooking. So.
How would that work? I mean, did she teach you her dishes, or did you kind of have to make stuff up on your own? How did you learn how to cook?
I remember that my mom is from Toisan, and she would pull me aside and have me stand next to her as she stir fried, the Chinese food, and that's how I learned. You have the hot wok, and make sure that the peanut oil is piping hot before you saute, and these are techniques that gets passed on, I think.
Would you have to cook for them too? Meaning, like, not just your brothers and sisters, but...
No, it's only occasionally when they couldn't come home on time to cook.
Yeah, I see.
Also, we ate a lot of pizza.
You ate Italian food?
I love it. So, well, to this day, when I come visit here, I go to Little Italy to make sure I have a piece of the Sicilian and also thin crust pizza.
Yeah.
And not just the Sicilian thick pizza, but also, there's also a sandwich shop on, I think, Mott Street. They make a potato and egg sandwich, which it's a real delicacy. With Italian rolls.
Wow. So, you were living on the edge of Little Italy and Chinatown.
Well, we moved from Spring Street after a couple of years to an apartment on Mulberry Street. It's actually 141 Mulberry on the top floor, which is, right across the street from the stage of the San Gennaro feast. And every year, we would lose sleep because it was so noisy. But that's, brought us closer to Chinatown, but not quite, because we were still Little Italy, I think. And I attended the PS 130 around the corner.
Back then, after you moved and went to PS1, PS30, is it?
130.
130. So, what was your relationship to Chinatown at that point? Did you go there, every day, or how did it change going from, PS21 to PS130?
Oh, yeah. Well, as I mentioned, my mom was college educated, so she knew the importance of an education. In fact, they came to the U.S. Part of the reason was to give us a chance to get a good education. This is what they did in those days. It didn't matter, hardship and the risk, whatever, because there was no opportunity for the four of us. Actually, there was three of us at that time to get a good education in Hong Kong. Because politically it was unstable, and schools were either very, very expensive, because only private schools and good schools, and there was no university there except for one, which is called the Hong Kong University. So when we came here, she put us in Chinese school at the WAQ, which is the Chinese school which is now still located, I think, in the community center on Mott Street, right? Yeah, so we would go there every day. After public schools from 9 to 3, we'd go there from 5 to 7. And we would walk from Mulberry Street down to Chinatown. Also started from Spring Street to Chinatown. So we were on our own pretty much. But looking back, in a way it was a little bit like extended daycare. But we got to learn Chinese. And it was a good school. Not only did we learn the language, traditionally, but we also learned history, culture, calligraphy. So I attended up to the 6th grade. So I was graduated 6th grade from WAQ Chinese school.
I wanted to ask about, you were talking about Chinese classes before, and what did you speak at home to your parents?
We spoke Cantonese and also some English. But with my mother, it was mostly Cantonese. But with my father, occasionally in English, because he was fluent in English from having studied it in China.
Were you more comfortable speaking in, English or Cantonese back then, like now that?
Oh, gee. I think it depends on the setting. At home, we spoke a lot of Cantonese, because that's how we conversed with my parents. But after, 6th grade, communicated always in English with the other kids.
And by this time, it was just your mom and dad and 2 brothers and a sister. What about grandparents, or did you have extended family that were living around you in America as well, in New York?
None in New York it would be second and third cousins, because my grand uncle, as I mentioned earlier, came here at the turn of the century with my grandfather. My grandfather worked and then went back to China, but his brother, my grand uncle, stayed. And from what I understand, he did very well in business here, and he had lots of kids. And they were very much Americanized, so we had, sort of an extended family here in New York. But in terms of grandparents, they both passed. My mother's and my father's parents passed when they were very young. For various reasons.
Like earlier you mentioned how your parents, you remember them being always forward looking. always.
They didn't look back.
They didn't look back, yeah. But did you try, when you were younger, did you, try to get them to talk about, what it was like back in China, or their, maybe their memories of their youth? Were they open to sharing those kinds of things?
My mother did. My father did not. I have to dig a lot in later years to really understand what he went through during the World War, and also his childhood. He didn't talk much about it. Maybe it's a guy and a gal thing, My mother just yeah. We got more than our share of the history there.
Why would she talk to you about these things? Why do you think she would want to share them?
Well, I have to believe that. I cannot tell. Her intention, I can understand as a parent. You want your children to know something about your roots, and we were uprooted, and it was good to understand where we came from. But was that her intention, or is that just a natural part of raising your children? Maybe a little of both.
So I want to get into sort of how you and your family got into church and like the kind of religious upbringing. That seemed to be a big part of your childhood. So could you talk about like what church you went to and sort of the different activities that came out of that?
Sure. We were Christians even back in Hong Kong, and so coming here, my mom met and became friends with this pastor. His name was Pastor Ho, and he was the head of the Chinese Conservative Baptist Church, which is located on the second floor of, I believe, 21 or 22 Pell Street. So we started attending it, and at that time, my brother and I mostly met with many of our peers. The church had a teenage fellowship, and we used to do a lot of things together, inside and outside the church. Also, I found looking back, mentors, because the deacon, for instance, is a Chinese American who was an engineer and Americanized, and he talked about working on transistors. And I thought, that's cool. And it was a congregation where the adults, just coincidentally, many ABCs or immigrants who adapted, here. And we had a woman named Ivy, I remember, who was studying a master's degree in music, and she conducted the choir, and I sang there, and so did my brother. And then there's a woman named Effie. She's a long-time resident of Chinatown, born and raised here. And she was a Sunday school teacher, and kind of looked after me a little bit, especially during a time, one summer we went to the summer camp. It was sponsored by the church. And, by then I had a real foul mouth growing up in New York City. And I was punished, I felt very unfairly treated, and Effie, came to comfort me because, and you'd be looking back, maybe as part of survival in the neighborhood and the streets, you have to have a high vocabulary of foul language, and to be very expressive. But it doesn't play well in other parts of the country or settings. But so it made me feel very comfortable. That was part of this community, and you know that I could see that, hey, you know, people get jobs and they do well, and you know they speak English, and so I'm looking back, I'm really glad I had that experience.
Can you? We'll return to church, but I just want to ask what your parents did, both of them, for work.
Sure. Oh, gee. Well, my mother worked as a seamstress, and my father, you know, worked at odd jobs. He even tried to get a, you know, job with an American company, but you know, he was in his early 40s, had no real job skills. His English was, you know, good. He was fluent, but so he ended up, you know, with my mother starting a sewing factory because they knew this couple, and together they started a sewing factory. And then after a number of years, they decided to split, and each couple started their own sewing factory. So, and both my mother and father were active in it. You know, he, because of his language skills, he was sort of played the role of a marketing salesperson, because the way that worked is that, you know, the Chinatown sewing factories provided the labor, right? And we would contract with the manufacturers on 7th Avenue. At that time, that was the garment center of the United States, you know, and heavily Jewish. So, you know, they got along very well because I think looking back, the Jewish people follow some very similar history. So they're very opening and very friendly with the Chinese people, from what I understand. So, whereas my mother, you know, she was more of the production queen. You know, she made sure that things get done on time and you know, met the deadlines. And there were occasions where we'd be called to go to the factory to help bag the garments, because that's the very last step before you ship it out. And timing is very important. You can't have a late delivery. So I remember being up night from 11 to 12. We were called about 9, 10 o'clock. We'd be there until midnight bagging garments. You know, I was in my teenage years. You know, so, but later on, you know, we helped out in other ways. And to be honest, you know, I understand business, you know, in so deeply, from having had that experience of knowing, well, what do you do? How do you put things together? You know, how do you make things, and how do you come up with a bid for a contract so that, you know, the pricing would at least pay for your salaries, and you pay for your salaries for your people, and you're not losing any money, and on occasion, my dad had me help him keep his books, so I learned double entry accounting. I didn't know it was that at the time, but you know, I was just going through the motions. But as you know, I have an MBA from NYU, and I tell you, I learned more working at the sewing factory than I did from the books, especially manufacturing. You know. So, yeah, but it was very hard work. You know, they were there 24/7 sometimes, and you know, they did everything. And I look back, you know, as a small business owner, there's no option. Failure is not an option, because there was no other channel of income. If the business fails, we're all out on the streets, you know, and they worked very hard at making sure that didn't happen. So, looking back, you know, we were somewhat victims because we were neglected. We were not at home. You know, we kind of took care of each other. And to be honest, a lot of our friends, their parents worked. You know, this was a working class community, you know. And they were like that too. Their fathers and mothers, they were working daytime and they were not around. And in some ways, we were each other's best friends. And we did spend a lot of time together. The basketball courts and church and fellowship, you know, it's, but we never thought of ourselves as being deprived. You know, we have each other. And so looking back, it was, again, it took a village, and that was our village.
Yeah, it's it's very moving actually to hear about. But actually, when I go back and ask about just like the, I guess the setup of the garment factory. You talked about 7th Avenue being, the kind of manufacturing district for garments.
Yes.
And so, and the Jewish people kind of being part of that business. But how did it work again with your parents? Did they have a shop here in Chinatown? And then, how did the sort of contracting of it work? Yeah.
I think the way it started was they didn't start on their own. They were formed. There were 2 other couples, they're friends of theirs. I think I didn't think there was any sort of how to start and manage a sewing factory school. In those days, New York City was a garment center, and many of my father's customers, who were the manufacturers, they do a lot of the mass merchandising. So these are not your high-end dresses. It's like sewing factories, mostly in women's fashion. And they would go to Paris and look at the latest fashion, come back, and they would make it with lesser expensive materials for the mass market, like J.C. Penney's or today's Target. But these are the merchandisers, and that's the business. And it was, as I understand, historically, it had been very prominently dominated by Jewish business people, and that's what I mentioned earlier. You can't be late. It's because J.C. Penney would promote certain fashion, and it would move right away. It's designed to move quickly. And in those days, and my parents' factory was not the only one. There was many of them in the Chinatown area that produced a lot of jobs for the people here. But there's no excuse for late deliveries. So that was the structure of the business. And I talk about, there's a union called the International Ladies Garments Workers Union, and my mother was a long-time member. And I look back, and they had a very important place because my mom became very ill, and if it weren't for the health benefits provided by the union, so we would have been in very difficult financial situation. So, and yes, my parents' shop was unionized. And so were a lot of other ones, because that's, there were perhaps other factories that were not, but I'm not that familiar with it.
I want to talk about going back to how you kids have to kind of fend for yourselves and kind of almost entertain yourselves too, with like the other kids, and just kind of like what kinds of activities, sports you got into. Definitely want to hear about like basketball, but like what did you do all day besides school?
Yeah, we like many of the kids in our neighborhood, their parents are almost not around, so we took care to look after each other, if you will. So there was basketball, and I belonged to a team called the Warriors, and we had cheerleaders, and we would have our practice and games at the True Light Church, which is the top floor. There was a gymnasium there. Later on, at the Church of All Nations, which is up in Houston and Bowery, I think. We played a lot of basketball in Columbus Park, as well as the PS1. They have a gym there, not gym, outdoor basketball courts. That was a very important part of our teenage years. Spent a lot of time. Oh, for us also James Center. James Center is another park in Mott and I think Hester, right, wasn't it?
Martin Hester, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Warriors, who organized that team? And like, was there a coach? Who else would you play?
There were actually two basketball teams at that time. One's called the Beavers, and then the one's called the Warriors. The Beavers were organized by a coach named Harold Louis. Harold Louis, we used to call him Cheesy. That was his nickname. Cheesy was the coach, and they had their practice and games at the True Light Church. And by the way, Cheesy is older brother of Effie, who was coincidentally
mentored you at the church.
Yeah. So their family, I guess, very community minded. So anyway, I think the Warriors were we started ourselves, and the coach. I think the coach's name is Benchy. I don't know I forgot his real name. We used to have, nicknames for each other. So Benchy was sort of a coach, and we had tournaments, and at that time we also had a cheerleading team of gals in the neighborhood. So we had Sweet 16 parties and dances. It was really nice. And I even had a hand in organizing a dance at the basement or the lower level of the Chinese Community Center at one time.
Would you play teams, like would you travel outside, Chinatown to play other teams, or?
We did not, but I know other teams did. But not the ones that I was with.
Yeah. And this is what, in the 70s at this point we're talking about, when you were playing 60s when you were playing basketball.
60s, yeah.
And what was Columbus Park like back then, like the basketball kind of culture?
It was pickup games. It can become it's a place where you prove yourself. And so mostly half-court basketball. There was also a full court, sort of I just can picture it sunken, but it's very dangerous because it was like, concrete on both sides, and and I remember we used to get hurt and falling against those concrete areas. In those days, you didn't have insulated poles that protect you from the basket walls. But that's why, having a practice and tournaments in these gyms were much safer.
You prefer playing inside versus outside?
I spend a lot of time playing outside. That's what you do. I have an older brother who started to play basketball, and I had the urge to try my hand at it, and it became sort of competitive. I do remember that in the playground, that the girls used to come out to watch. And I realized that, hey, you're a good player, you get a lot of attention. So I became a fairly good basketball player. I had a dead shot from the circle, even though I was not the biggest kid in the neighborhood. But I tried hard to. I practiced a lot. was on the basketball court just practicing a lot. And I had this facility of, a dead shot from the circle. You watch basketball, I guess, Stephen Curry of the Warriors, who's one of my heroes. He has this fast release. That's what I had, because I wasn't a very tall person. But I always been able to release that ball before the defense came. So I used to be very proud that I could, beat these guys who are taller than me in basketball.
Yeah, back then, were you watching any of the pros? I mean, were you into?
Oh, the Knicks were, that was our team. There was a time of Willis Reed and Walt Frazier and Bill Bradley, and Rhett Holtzman was the coach. And the type of basketball that they played was very different from today. It was very much a team effort. You passed the ball around a lot, and you always aimed to get that layup. The 3-point shots were not around in those days, and it was really fun to watch. And Dollar Bill, he was sort of admired by kids who were on the academic track, because he was Princeton, in addition to being a good basketball player.
Dollar Bill was Bill Bradley?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's funny that you had a cheerleading squad for this kind of club team, the Warriors.
Yeah, looking back, again, another, lucky thing about growing up here is that the subways there. We used to do things together, boys and girls. We'd go to Coney Island and just make these trips together because we didn't have to drive. And, and the subway can take you all over. And I remember we used to go on dates, just taking the subway to the cloisters, and to Coney Island, and to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and even before we were old enough to drive, we expanded our horizon.
Yeah.
So New York City subways, it's taken a lot of beating, but I still think it's a wonderful system. It runs all the time.
Yeah. Other entertainment in Chinatown. I was looking at your sort of biography you put together for us, and I know Sun Sing Theater. I think a relative ran it, movie theaters. Music, you talked about doo-wop, and those kind of groups like Fortune Cookies. Can you talk about these kinds of entertainment, the entertainment scene of Chinatown?
Well, through that era around the 60s, we had a lot of parties, and we had our own band and singing group, the Dynasties and the Fortune Cookies.
Were you part of the Dynasties?
No, but I knew the people, and the head of the Dynasty, his name was William Wong. I think we call him Y. And I remember he attended Junior High School 65 and played the violin. And he had the same instructor that I had. His name is Peter Pappy. And he became a guitarist on the Dynasties, and guess where he learned how to play? It was at Junior High School 165 in the music class. I think they were a good band, and also the Fortune Cookies. I remember a couple of gals also were students at Junior High School 65. I think one of whom is Joanne Lee, who's still around.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun times we had together.
Now I want to ask you about this is probably getting into your high school years and kind of where you went to high school, and also at that time, like did you have what were your kind of hopes and dreams for yourself, going into kind of adulthood?
Well, I was very lucky. I took the entrance exam to Brooklyn Tech and I got in. So I left junior high school 65 after the 8th grade and started at Brooklyn Tech. It was at that time all boys, 6,000 boys, and I was very good at math and physics. So with the encouragement of my parents, I was on the track of becoming an engineer. And we meaning that there were a number of Chinese guys from the neighborhood who also were admitted to Brooklyn Tech, and we used to take the subway, to DeKalb Avenue every day, where Brooklyn Tech was located. And looking back, I'm very fortunate because it was a wonderful education for a lot of different reasons. I can go into it, but I thought it gave me a real path to my career. No, I think it was just a wonderful opportunity because you learn a lot when you don't have distractions with girls around. Although, looking back, that was one of the things we all miss most of all. And, not very good at building social skills, but that's a different story. But we were focused on academics, and the school was, and the teachers were wonderful. I was encouraged to, go into the honor society, which is called Aristotle. And the school, you have to have good grades as well as service credits. So I did a lot of services to get the credits that would qualify me to become a member of the honor society. And one of the things I did, in those days you could participate in what I call a police force. They're monitors. When you have a school of 6,000 boys, someone has to keep orders. So they have a whole group of students who serve as sort of, I look back and call them the SS police. So that they were there to make sure that you're not running up the stairs, you're not smoking in the bathrooms and stuff like that. So you earn credits to do that. For me, I found myself bussing trays in the cafeteria as part of what I did for my service credits. And and the school is always modeled in the military fashion. So you could be beginning busing trays for your other students, and you move up to be a manager of and the section leader and so on, so you get more service credits. And of course the detractors used to call us slop cops. Okay. So these are, but we earn our credits, and that's part of the education. And I look back at it, and it's a wonderful opportunity. High quality education. As you know, this is a publicly funded high school. Anyone can get in as long as you qualify, with passing the entrance exam. Mm-hmm. And when I was there, it was very diverse. Students came from all over the 5 boroughs. We all took the subway to school. There were Italians, Greeks, Jews, blacks, Puerto Ricans. But we all had one thing in common, we missed the girls.
We're going to move on to talking about college life, and you wanted to be an engineer. Is that what you wound up majoring in at Binghamton? And maybe talk about just your college experience.
I think when I started college, I felt that there was something missing, because I was so focused and good at math and physics. I wasn't very, how would I say, I wasn't a reader, I wasn't a very good communicator either. And I found that in college, you start taking the basic liberal arts courses, and I loved them, but I didn't do well because I couldn't write, I couldn't, those weak spots. So that's one thing, and I lost interest in obviously in engineering. But the other thing is that the world was changing at that time. The Vietnam War was almost at its height. In my freshman year, I found out that I was, and I was part of the first military draft at that time. And because we needed soldiers to fight in Vietnam. And so the country came up with a lottery system for the draft. So that, you get a number based upon your birth date. And every year there would be a lottery where, in which that was determined. And my freshman year, I found out I was number 15 in the draft lottery, which means that you're almost sure to be drafted and possibly go to Vietnam. Now, at that time, the war was not, a popular war. We didn't know why we were there. The country was divided over where we should be there or not. And we saw it on television, every other night, Asian people getting massacred and killed. So it wasn't comforting to know that, hey, that would be my destiny after I leave college. Now, in those days, when you're still in college, you won't be drafted. You're given a 4-year deferment. So when the 4 years is up, whether you graduate or not, you're going into the military. So, which is what happened to me, except for the fact that the year that I graduated, that my deferment expired, was the same year that we started pulling troops back from Vietnam. And Nixon was running for re-election, so it was good politics not to draft more people that year. And because of that, I was not drafted, and I was put into a lower priority, so to speak. So basically, I got out of the draft legally, although some people, as you know, left the country and did other things to get out of it. But because of that happening in my freshman year, it changed my whole outlook to life. It kind of forced me to question myself as well as, I'm risking my life here for my country. What is this place called America? I want to find out more about it. I think, and for that matter, I want to discover this other part for myself. I've always been sort of a creative person in the arts as well, right? And so I changed totally my studies to that of history and theater. So I found myself at the SUNY Binghamton, the State University of New York in Binghamton, because at that time I had a Regents scholarship, so I didn't have to pay tuition. And I worked in summers, and partially my folks helped me out in terms of living expenses. So it made it possible for me to go to upstate New York to experience sort of a semi-rural, suburban campus life, which I loved. Because I found myself amongst theater people, it was just a wonderful community because, looking back, people in the arts are like innocent people that have grown up. But because of it, they're very spontaneous, they're very creative, they think differently, and they live and eat their emotions with their emotions. And they may be totally irrational, but they're wonderful people to be with. It's a community, which is what I found. And in a way, I learned a lot about, American culture, pop culture, as well as American history, plus through studying theater as a theater major. We studied historical literature, dramatic literature, and I was very fortunate to be cast in a major role in a production called Alchemy Da Vinci, which is a comedy, and it ran for 2 weeks. And the theater department at that time trained its students to be professionals. So what we did was we'd go to class in the daytime, and then in the evening we'd go into production and performance. So you have to be all there. And you have to be able to get a good night's sleep, so the next day you could go to class, and then in the evening you'd go and perform again. So that was by design, because this is discipline that you have to have if you're going to be a performer. So I was very lucky to have had that experience, and because I was the only Asian person in that whole department, I think I got noticed, and I also did very well, in terms of my grades. I had a chance to work with the department head on another play called The Servant of Two Masters, which is a play that was written about 400 years ago. It's a comedy, and we produced it. I was the assistant director as well as the stage manager for that show. And again, it ran for 2 weeks. But I learned so much from the department head, who was also the director of this, director and producer of this play. Between my junior and senior year, I noticed a lot of the professional inclined students would apply for a summer stock apprentice, because that seems to be a way to really learn from professionals. So I did, I didn't know anything about it, but I was accepted into this apprenticeship program at the Falmouth Playhouse on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And the Falmouth Playhouse had been a long 50 years, one of the summer theaters, as part of a chain of summer theaters in the northeast part of the United States. And it's a professional equity theater, and it's managed, produced, and performed by professionals who are members of the Actors Equity. And in those days, there were two types of shows that we put on. Ones that were, popular shows with name stars, and others that are on trial for Broadway. Because producers, before sinking a lot of money into putting a show on Broadway, they want to make sure that there's an audience there. They're able to fine-tune, the shows before they put on Broadway, because a flop, you can lose a lot of money if it turns out to be a flop. And that's what the Falmouth Playhouse did, and I was very lucky to spend 4 months there. And every week we would have a different role. I would be working under the design, light designer, I'd be painting sets, working with a carpenter, building platforms, and I'd be in the front office, the box office, every facet of theater as an apprentice, and it was a wonderful apprentice program. You would have that role there, working with a professional, under a professional each week. And I have my taste in of professional theater, and I even had a walk-on role as a bellhop in a show starring Shirley Booth, which at that time she was a very big star.
That's fascinating. You sound like you're on track to, a kind of career as a theater actor. How did your parents feel about this move?
They thought I went. They thought I went through the deep end there, and they were obviously concerned and opposed. I do have an older brother who became engineer. He's a double E electronics, electrical engineer. And of course, they expected me to follow the same path, but I didn't, and I was sort of a rebel. It was very hard, and because they sacrificed, and I think there might be other sons and daughters of immigrants who might have gone through that same, conflict. But I felt that and because of the draft, I think it changed my outlook, because I said, "There's no one else who's going to help you here. You're on your own. You're on." So that changed my whole outlook. And I said, "Okay, this is what I have to do, and this is what I have to do. You got to do what you got to do." But luckily for my parents, they did not disown me. They were not pleased. They were curious where this is leading to, but they didn't cut me off either. So I owe them for that.
I kind of want to move on and talk about kind of post-college years and sort of what you wound up doing, because it's so interesting. You did wind up getting like an MBA, I think, and then working at Deloitte, but you also worked at Atari. So can you kind of talk about post-college life, post kind of like Binghamton life?
Oh yeah. Well, before I even get to that, I want to talk about how I got from theater to an MBA. Because I did come back to Manhattan, and I tried my hand at acting as a career. And I had an apartment up in the West Side where there were a lot of theater people, because I enjoyed being with them. And everyone had a sort of a sidekick to pay rent, and I drove a taxi, and I was at Christmas sales at Saks Fifth Avenue. I did assistant teacher at Seward Park High School Annex. I think it was under the Title I program, and they put all these troubled students in the annex, and that's why they funded assistant to the teacher, and I was one of those guys. Anyway, after a while, I was starving, and I just didn't think this was going anywhere. As you know, there was no jobs for, not many, for Asian people in those days. So I went door to door looking for sort of a full-time job, and I was lucky to come across this opportunity through an agency to work for the Dun & Bradstreet as a credit reporter. And I attribute, at least one of the things about theater training is that you become a good communicator. So I think I talked myself into this. So I got some value from that theater degree. And so it was the Dun & Bradstreet credit reporting job, and what I did there was used to write credit reports, and also to call up and interview chief financial officers or controllers for these companies that had some credit problems. I would ask them, hey, you paid late, this company, that company, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, do you have your, set of financial statements to send us? Because I had a 30 days training to do this, the questions to ask. And I became really interested in that business, because I started reading financial statements, and I had help in analyzing those numbers. And because I had some background with the family business, I understood. And one of the reasons for, this particular division of Dun & Bradstreet looked after companies in the electronics and garment apparel industry, which is very volatile. Lots of bankruptcies. And it fit right in, and I did very well. And I realized that, I want to do better. I remember at the cafeteria, one of my colleagues, who's much older, he's been there for like 25 years, he lectured me. So, no one who ever worked here has become a millionaire. I said, what's telling me that? I said, so I, at that time, decided to apply for entry to NYU's MBA program. And luckily, they accepted me. I did very well, and I graduated with honors, and I was recruited to work for a firm called Haskins and Sells, which is now called Deloitte Touche. But they were the premier blue chip CPA firm auditing all the financial institutions, like Merrill Lynch. That was one of my clients, Bank of New York, Morgan Stanley. They had a corner on all these financial institutions. Very conservative, but they took me on, and I learned a lot and became a CPA, licensed CPA, and that's. Well, at that time I was still a bachelor, so I was sort of itching to, get out of New York. So I went out to the West Coast for a visit and fell in love with it, and sent out a number of resumes, and I went out there for interviews and had 4 offers. And I think probably because Haskins and Sells was, a good brand to have in the finance community. And it turned out one of the companies that offered me a job also offered to move me from New York to California, and that was the Southern Pacific Railroad, which was the original one half of the Transcontinental Railroad. Yeah. It's called the Central Pacific, but later on it was merged with the Southern Pacific. So it was the same track. And, this is the company that brought all the Chinese to work on the railroads. I said, oh man, that's super. Having had some history, background, I said, gee, this is where things started. I got to do this. So I accepted the offer, and for the next 3 years, I traveled half my time throughout the 14 states where the Southern Pacific had its operations. So I was an internal audit supervisor, and I would do operational and financial audits, and would visit all the facilities throughout the southern part of the United States. And it was an eye-opener because I got to see a really big part of the country. It's very diverse geographically, climate-wise, and people-wise. And I very often encounter people who never had face-to-face meeting with any kind of Asian person. They were very curious about me. And I think because I was representing the railroad, I was treated very professionally, as you would if you were faced with an auditor who could be writing you up. So maybe it was because of my status that they treated me well, they welcomed me, but there were also people just plain ignorant. They would be calling me names like Chinaman, this and that, in a very friendly way, not knowing that it's derogatory. So I had a great experience, and also these little towns. I always try to look for a Chinese restaurant because the history is that after the railroads, the Chinese used to settle in these communities and open up a restaurant. And to this day, I still have an attachment to it. I was in Promontory, Utah for the 150th anniversary of the completion of the railroad, and so still keep in touch.
Yeah, it's amazing journey when I think about it. Theater to then being a taxi driver, and kind of living an artist's life, and then then working on this railroad, that has such a long history. And but I do want to ask you about Atari, because I think it's such an interesting place. Or for me, it's has this
Did you play the game?
I did, yeah, definitely. Had the system.
5200. You have a set.
Had the set, yeah. But how did you get involved with them, and what did you do for them?
Oh yeah, well, first of all, you talked about all these things. I look back and I'm so fortunate to have had the opportunity to sort of follow my passion. And I tell young people who, when they ask me about these things, don't be afraid to take these chances in your life, especially when you're still young. There's a way to recover from it, and it's not because it's natural. It's because we do have a society here that tolerates that kind of risk-taking, and this is part of America that no one really talked about, especially if they haven't grown up here. That you could do things and follow your dreams. You may not get there the first time, like in acting. I would have been starving, but I had to change course. But you could pivot here, and the society will accommodate that. And I talk about talking myself into a job. I don't lie to people. I'm very open about what happened, and there will be ears there, and they would think, oh, this person has taken some chances. Maybe we should also take a chance on it. I suppose that's part of the American experience, and I found that to be true for me, at least. Anyway, so getting back to Atari, and I was in internal auditing, and Southern Pacific at that time was going through a merger because they were being bought. And some crazy things there, and I said, no, there's no future here because things are changing. So I pivoted, and at that time found this company called Atari. It had just introduced Pac-Man, and overnight they became one of the billion-dollar startup, probably the first billion-dollar startup ever in the Silicon Valley, and they needed to start an internal audit department because it was so crazy. We had 60 buildings throughout the Silicon Valley in places like Milpitas, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara, where we were building things. We were making things there, like the console, the coin-operated games, the software. It was spread out all over. So they needed an internal audit function, and I was hired on as part of the team to start a new department. Again, I was very fortunate, and maybe not, but I still attribute it to my theater training that I was able to do well in interviews. Because it's just not about a piece of resume, it's about good people. So I got hired on, and it was just a wonderful experience to see all these things happening around me. I met lots of people who kept in touch with. Atari, if you know the history, was a startup company. A company started by a guy named Bushnell, Nolan Bushnell. He also started Chuck E. Cheese, which is a franchise of games for children. And at the time, he had two technicians, one of whom is called Steve Jobs of Apple, and the other is Wozniak, his partner. But he sold the company to Warner Communications here in New York. Warner Communications is a marketing powerhouse. So they acquired Atari, sunk in millions of dollars to try to build up this new industry called video games. And that's what was happening at the time when I joined. So, this is Atari, right? And created a new industry. And at that time, Atari was a brand name only second to Coca-Cola. And it's not because of Steve Jobs or Bushnell, is because the corporate marketers are from Warner Communications.
Interesting.
But the rest is history. They realized after this time that it was the software that was the money maker, not the hardware. They couldn't make it cheap enough to ship everything overseas to Taiwan, islands, tax havens, and they got into financial trouble one year because they were so complacent. They thought it's such a new thing, we just put these things out there, these products, they'll sell themselves. So they licensed the rights to E.T. E.T. is the movie by Steven Spielberg. It's very popular with the families and children. So they made a game, sunk a lot of money into it with the title of E.T. And in those days, technology-wise, the video games were in the cassette, and in it is a chip. It's called a ROM chip. ROM meaning read-only memory, which means that you burn it in, that's it. There's no other use for that chip. So they sunk in gazillions of dollars preparing for the Christmas sale. This is the consumer products business. You build inventory and it all sells in Christmas and you make money. Well, guess what? No one wanted that game. And they ended up with such a disaster. And, it's become folklore because there's a documentary I remember showing how they were somewhere in Arizona burying these cassettes with, tractors because there was no use for them. And they lost a lot of money.
Wow. And
the company basically almost went bankrupt.
Wow. Were you there at that
Yes.
time for all
And
this?
that's why I left. And that's why I left, and I went on to other businesses in the Silicon Valley. I guess I'm speaking as an insider because I worked there. I'm not an investor. I actually work in the companies with people, and it's a wonderful and unique community, the Silicon Valley, because it's one of the few places where, risk takers are encouraged to take risks, and failure is tolerated because you don't always win the first time. And there are examples of entrepreneurs who started 3 failed companies, and the 4th one was actually a big winner. And it only happens because, again, there was enough venture capital that poured into this community to support that kind of innovation. And there could not be, and I'm not the first one to say this, but innovation has its own cost, the cost of failure. One example is Thomas Edison failed so many times before he invented and perfected the light bulb. And that's the kind of culture that, thrives in the Silicon Valley. I was very fortunate to be in the middle of all this, and partially because of that, I worked for a number of different technology companies that made things that are very essential to industry. And I like that because I like working on making things versus making money trading on paper, which is kind of what I started doing when I was an auditor in Manhattan here with Merrill Lynch and the brokers, and I just had this thing about me that I wanted more tangible things, spending my time with tangible results.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of theme throughout your life, I guess. The idea of reinventing yourself, or sort of taking risks, and then kind of risking failure, and just kind of trusting yourself also.
It really wasn't planned, and again, I look back, it's because of the draft. When I was selected 15, it changed my life. I had a different outlook. I was, raised in a conservative Chinese family. You follow that path, become a good engineer, because we sacrificed so much for you. It's kind of beaten to your head, right? But that's when I discovered that I'm on my own, because there's no one who's going to help me. If I get drafted, it's my life now. So one thing leads to another, and I think once you've taken a certain risk and you think, oh, I survived. You know the song, if it didn't kill you, it makes you stronger. So,
Yeah. I wanted to ask you just something going back to like the 1960s, because you lived through this period of where the term Asian American became formulated, and it happened on college campuses. You were kind of in college, I think, around this time. So, do you remember anything about that kind of cultural moment? Because it also was part of like the Vietnam War moment. The formation of like the Asian American identity. Do you remember anything about how that?
Oh, good question.
How you intersected with that?
Yeah, good question. I was active at the basement workshop, and my peers were all, I had long hair, and I had the same kind of concern about growing up in the country where we're not recognized as part of the country. And I think we all question that. We were American born. I was not, but I was, close to it, and not really acknowledged as Americans, which is a different problem with our parents, because they came here, they worked. That's not the concern. It has to do with identity, and identity as an American, so. Yeah, so I was involved in that, and thought that my getting into theater, one of the outcome was hopefully to change the stereotypes you see out there that I grew up with from television and movies, where the only Asian faces you ever seen. And there's also a guy thing. There's no guys out there who are manly idols except for one, James Segata. That's the only guy. If you look back in history, there are also women, in Hollywood and television who were portrayed as human beings. Okay. But Chinese men, they're terrible stereotypes. And and if you're going to do anything to change America's perception of Chinese Americans or Asians, and do away with this discriminatory discrimination you face, you have to convince the average American that we're human beings and three-dimensional, blah, 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 blah. And I thought that's the way you do it, in the media. So that was one of the reasons why I studied theater and tried my hand at acting, is because of getting in front of a camera. But that's history.
Yeah.
Yes, so I'm very familiar with that Asian American movement, and I knew people who were very active in the basement workshop, and still considered to be my buddies. You may know them, George Chu as well.
Yeah.
There's Victor, we call him Bird, Victor Huey, filmmaker, and the woman Frances Chang, she's a poet writer. So but for me, again, the draft changed me, because I left and went up to New York, Binghamton, and I was disconnected with the Chinese American community. But I kept in touch.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just last thing I want to have you do is just, could you just say the names of your parents, and then also your brothers and sister? Oh
yeah, my parents is Peter and Shunyi Chang. I have 3 siblings. Chester is the oldest. I'm the second, Audie. I have a sister, Maisie, and younger brother named Owen. They were all born under different governments. Did I mention that?
You mentioned that. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah.
Well, I see myself as a modern refugee. Just circumstance, politics, changing world. We just moved around. We're uprooted. And I'd like to think that now that I'm transplanted in the United States, it's just a beautiful country, because I study history. There's nowhere in history from a nationality standpoint where you can come from somewhere else and you live here, you're rooted here, and you're like treated like anybody else who's ever been here for hundreds of years. I've never seen that in history. So we're still an experimental democracy to some extent, but I think it's very unique, and I'm so fortunate to be here. And I don't think I could have happened if it were for America. This would not happen in China or Hong Kong, or Great Britain or whatever, but we have such an open society. At least that's my experience. So, but I guess maybe you have to go find it, right?